A lonely millionaire returns to his mansion from a long trip and finds his assistant in his bed. "Hi, my very beautiful, precious and loyal family. How are you today? I love you beyond words, my beautiful family, like my real family, my heart, my soul. My beautiful sisters and brothers, my precious daughters and sons, you are the light in my life, the love that keeps me going. Every single one of you is special to me, and I hold you close to my heart." A beautiful prayer for my precious family. May love surround you like a warm embrace. May happiness fill your heart like the morning sun, and may peace follow you wherever you go. May every tear be replaced with laughter, every worry with faith, and every dream with a beautiful reality. May your days be blessed with love, success, and endless joy. I pray that no sadness touches your heart, no pain lingers in your soul, and no darkness dims your beautiful light. You are loved, cherished, and forever blessed. My precious family, thank you from the deepest part of my heart for the overwhelming love and support in the last video. Your love lifts me up, your words give me strength, and your presence means everything to me. We are making a powerful comeback, stronger than ever, and with your love, we will rise higher than before. Never forget how much I love you. Please like, comment, and share every video, because together we are unbreakable, unstoppable, and forever connected. Let's begin with love, my beautiful family. The journey home had been long. Brian Hanna stared out of the car window as his driver navigated the winding road leading to his mansion. 3 months away on business had drained him. At 42, Brian had achieved everything society defined as success, the wealth, the property, the respect. Yet the emptiness inside him had only grown deeper with each passing year. Rain tapped gently against the window, matching his melancholy mood. The grey skies perfectly mirrored the coldness he expected to find waiting for him at home. Home. The word felt hollow. His 10-bedroom mansion had never truly felt like home, just a showcase of his financial achievements after years of struggle. "We're here, sir," his driver announced, pulling up to the grand entrance. Brian nodded, gathering his briefcase. "Thank you, Marcus. Take the rest of the day off." The mansion loomed before him, impressive yet somber against the darkening sky. Brian stood in the rain for a moment, looking up at the place where he slept, but never truly rested. With a deep sigh, he walked up the steps and unlocked the door, expecting the familiar silence to greet him. But something was different. The usual emptiness had been replaced by subtle changes. A vase of fresh wildflowers sat on the entryway table. The air smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, rather than the sterile cleanliness he was accustomed to. Soft music drifted from somewhere within the house, a gentle piano piece he recognized as Debussy. Brian set down his briefcase, intrigued. His new assistant, Lois Walters, had been hired just before his departure. They had only met briefly during her interview, and he had given her instructions remotely while traveling. By all accounts from his property manager, she had been efficient and thorough, but these touches went beyond efficiency. They spoke of thoughtfulness, of care. Brian loosened his tie as he made his way through the house. More small changes caught his eye. Books arranged not by size and color as his previous staff had done, but in a way that suggested someone had been reading them. A throw blanket casually draped over his living room sofa. A half-finished cup of tea on the kitchen counter. For the first time in years, his house felt lived in. Exhaustion overtook curiosity as Brian climbed the grand staircase to his bedroom. The travel fatigue weighed heavily on his shoulders. All he wanted now was the comfort of his own bed after months of hotel rooms. He pushed open his bedroom door and froze. There, in the middle of his California king bed, lay a woman fast asleep. Her dark skin contrasted beautifully with the white bedding, her natural curls spread across his pillow like a crown. One hand was tucked beneath her cheek, the other resting on an open book on the duvet. It was Lois Walters, his assistant. Brian's initial shock gave way to something unexpected, not anger at the intrusion, but a strange sense of wonder. In sleep, her face held a peaceful vulnerability that struck him deeply. She looked exhausted, with faint shadows beneath her eyes suggesting long hours of work. Around her he noticed the evidence of her labor, freshly laundered clothes neatly folded in stacks, new linens, a handwritten welcome note on the nightstand, next to a glass of water and his preferred brand of aspirin. She had been preparing for his return and must have succumbed to exhaustion in the process. Brian should have been angry. This was a clear crossing of professional boundaries. Yet as he watched her gentle breathing, all he felt was a peculiar warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time since returning, he felt truly at home. He cleared his throat softly. Lois's eyes fluttered open, confusion clearing into horrified recognition as she bolted upright. "Mr. Hannah, oh my God!" She scrambled off the bed, nearly knocking over the bedside lamp in her haste. "I'm so sorry. I was changing the sheets and must have. I didn't mean to." Her mortification was evident in the deep flush spreading across her cheeks and the way her hands frantically tried to smooth her wrinkled blouse. "It's all right, Ms. Walters," Brian said, his voice gentle with an understanding that surprised even him. "No, it's completely unprofessional. I was up late preparing everything for your return, and I just sat down for a moment to—" She gestured helplessly to the bed, unable to finish her explanation. Brian noticed the dark circles under her eyes more clearly now. "How long have you been working today?" Lois glanced at her watch and winced. "About 16 hours, sir. I wanted everything to be perfect for your arrival." Something in her dedication touched him deeply. After 2 failed relationships, his marriage to Vanessa and the brief romance with Rebecca, Brian had grown accustomed to people wanting him for what he could provide, not for who he was. But Lois's efforts seemed genuine, born from professional dedication rather than personal gain. "I think that level of commitment deserves rest, not apologies," he said. Lois looked up, surprise evident in her warm brown eyes. She had expected anger, perhaps even dismissal. "Thank you for understanding, Mr. Hannah. It won't happen again." She gathered her things quickly, professional mask sliding back into place. "I've prepared your favorite meal in the kitchen, just needs reheating. The household report is on your desk, and I've scheduled nothing for you tomorrow to allow recovery. Time from your trip." Brian nodded, finding himself reluctant to see her go. "The house feels different," he said simply. Lois paused at the door, uncertainty crossing her features. "Different in a bad way?" "No," Brian said truthfully. "Different in a way it needed to be." A small smile touched her lips, transforming her face in a way that made Brian's breath catch. "Welcome home, Mr. Hannah." After she left, Brian sat on the edge of his bed, running his hand over the spot where she had been sleeping. It was still warm. He looked around at his bedroom, seeing it through new eyes. The cold perfection had been replaced with something more lived in, more real. For years following his divorce from Vanessa, who had married him for his money and left when she found someone wealthier, and his breakup with Rebecca, who couldn't handle the emotional walls he'd built, Brian had kept people at a distance. His wealth attracted many, but few saw the man beneath the millions, the boy who had grown up with nothing, who had fought for everything he had. Lois Walters had been in his home for 3 months, and somehow she had brought more warmth to it than he had in 5 years. Brian showered and changed, his mind continually drifting back to the image of Lois, asleep in his bed. It wasn't a sexual thought, but something deeper, the simple human connection that had been missing from his life for so long. As he ate the meal she had prepared, his favorite lamb stew that somehow tasted like his grandmother's recipe. Brian realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow, not because of business or achievements, but because it meant seeing Lois Walters again. The emptiness that had accompanied him home had begun to fill with something new, something that felt dangerously like hope. Chapter 2. Walls and windows. Morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains as Brian Hanna opened his eyes. For the first time in months, he had slept deeply, without the restlessness that usually plagued him. The memory of finding Lois in his bed brought an unexpected smile to his face. He showered and dressed casually, opting for jeans and a simple button-down rather than his usual suit. Today wasn't about business. Today was about establishing a new rhythm in his own home. When Brian entered the kitchen, Lois was already there, efficiently preparing breakfast. She wore a simple yellow dress that complemented her dark skin beautifully, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She turned at his entrance, her professional smile tinged with lingering embarrassment from yesterday's encounter. "Good morning, Mr. Hanna. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Brian admitted, watching as she moved around his kitchen with comfortable familiarity. "And please, call me Brian. Mr. Hanna makes me feel like my father." Lois hesitated, then nodded. "Brian, then. Coffee is ready." He accepted the mug she offered, noticing she had prepared it exactly as he preferred, strong with just a touch of cream, no sugar. Another small detail she had bothered to learn about him. "I've prepared a light breakfast," she continued, setting a plate of avocado toast and fresh fruit before him. "The kitchen has been fully restocked, and I've organized everything based on frequency of use." Brian studied her as she spoke. In daylight, he could appreciate her beauty more fully. Her features were strong yet delicate, her movements graceful and purposeful. But it was her eyes that captivated him, intelligent, perceptive, with depths he couldn't fathom. "Thank you," he said. "But please join me. I'd like to know more about the person who's been keeping my home running." Surprise flickered across her face. "That's not necessary," said Brian. "I've already eaten." "Then just the company, then." He gestured to the chair across from him. After a moment's hesitation, Lois sat, her posture perfect, hands folded neatly on the table. The invisible barrier of employer and employee stretched between them. "Tell me about yourself," Brian said, taking a bite of the perfectly prepared toast. "Beyond what was in your resume." Lois seemed to consider her words carefully. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in Philadelphia. I have a younger sister, Zora, who's studying medicine at Johns Hopkins. I help with her tuition when I can." "And your parents?" "Both gone. My father when I was 14, my mother 5 years ago." The simple statement held volumes of unspoken pain and responsibility. Brian recognized it well, the burden of becoming the family backbone too young. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. Lois gave a small shrug. "Life happens. You adjust." "That you do," Brian agreed, seeing a reflection of his own philosophy in her words. "And what about your dreams? Surely it wasn't to manage some millionaire's empty house." A genuine smile touched her lips then. "I write. Nothing published yet, but it's my passion." "What kind of writing?" "Poetry, mostly. Some short stories." She seemed embarrassed by the admission. "I'm working on a novel, but finding time is difficult." Brian finished for her. Their eyes met, and for a moment the professional barrier thinned. Brian felt a connection he hadn't experienced in years, the simple recognition of one soul understanding another. The moment passed as Lois stood, smoothly, transitioning back to her professional self. "I should get to work. I've organized your mail by priority. Would you like me to reschedule your meetings for next week, or will you be returning to the office tomorrow?" Brian considered. Normally, he would have been eager to dive back into work, using it as a shield against the emptiness of his personal life. But now the thought of his office held less appeal than it once had. "I'll work from home this week," he decided. "Set up what can't be avoided as video calls." Lois nodded, making a note on her tablet. "Will there be anything else?" Brian wanted to say yes, to find some reason to keep her there, to continue their conversation. Instead, he shook his head. "No, thank you." After she left, Brian wandered through his house, seeing it through new eyes. The mansion had always been a symbol of his success. Purchased after his tech company's IPO made him wealthy beyond his childhood dreams. But until now, it had never felt like more than an expensive shell. In his study, Brian found the household report Lois had mentioned. Opening it, he was struck by the meticulous detail. Beyond the expected accounting and maintenance updates, she had included suggestions for improvements, not to the house's value, but to its livability. A garden space that could be revitalized, rooms that might be repurposed for actual use rather than show. At the back of the report, Brian found a small note. "I hope you don't mind, but I donated the expired canned goods to the local food bank in your name and replaced them. I also found several designer suits that no longer fit and had them tailored for the men's employment program downtown. Receipt attached if you wish to be reimbursed." The thoughtfulness behind these actions struck Brian deeply. Lois had seen needs and filled them without fanfare, using resources that would have otherwise gone to waste. Throughout the day, Brian found himself creating reasons to interact with Lois. A question about a file, a need for coffee. Each time, she was professional yet warm, maintaining the boundaries he himself had established in his request to know her better. By evening, Brian had learned more, that Lois had put herself through college while raising her sister after their mother's death, that she volunteered at a literacy program on weekends, that her dream was to eventually open a small bookstore cafe where community writers could gather. He also learned she had a subtle sense of humor that emerged in brief flashes, and that when she spoke of her writing, her whole face transformed. With passion, these discoveries felt like treasures, each one chipping away at the walls Brian had built around himself after Vanessa's betrayal and Rebecca's departure. Vanessa had married him on his way up, claiming love, but leaving the moment. A wealthier prospect appeared. Rebecca had come later, seeming to want the real him, but ultimately finding his emotional scars too difficult to navigate. After those experiences, Brian had decided relationships weren't worth the inevitable pain. He had his success. He had his wealth. He didn't need the complication of another heart to break his own. Yet watching Lois move through his home with quiet purpose, Brian felt something he thought long dead stir within him. Interest, curiosity, and the dangerous beginnings of attraction. That evening, after Lois had gone to her apartment in the guest house, Brian sat on his terrace with a glass of whiskey, contemplating the subtle shift in his world. The professional in him warned against complicating a good working relationship. The lonely man in him argued that true connections were too rare to ignore. Brian's thoughts were interrupted by movement in the garden below. Lois walked among the neglected rose bushes, notebook in hand, occasionally stopping to write. The setting. Sun gilded her profile, creating a picture of such simple beauty that it made his chest ache. She paused beneath his grandmother's old oak tree, running her hand reverently over its bark before sitting at its base. Even from a distance, Brian could see the peaceful transformation of her features as she wrote, lost in her own world of words and imagination. In that moment, Brian realized the walls he had built to protect himself had also become his prison, cutting him off from the possibility of real connection. Lois Walter, with her quiet strength and hidden depths, had somehow opened a window in those walls, allowing fresh air into the stale corners of his heart. The question now was whether he had the courage to step through. Chapter 3. unexpected. Comfort a week passed in a comfortable rhythm. Brian found himself looking forward to the small daily interactions with Lois. Morning coffee discussions, brief consultations about household matters, the occasional shared meal when work kept them both late. Each exchange revealed new layers to his intriguing assistant, while maintaining the professional boundaries that kept them safely apart. Until the morning, Brian woke with his head pounding and his body burning with fever. He had spent the previous day in a video conference with investors in Singapore, pushing through fatigue and a scratchy throat. Now, attempting to rise from bed sent the room spinning around him. The clock read 9:30 a.m., hours past his usual start time. His phone showed 3 missed calls from Lois. As if summoned by his thoughts, a gentle knock sounded at his bedroom. "Daw, Brian, are you all right?" Lois's voice carried concern. "Fine," he managed, his voice a raspy whisper that belied his claim. The door opened slowly, and Lois appeared, her expression shifting from worry to clarity as she assessed his condition. Without hesitation, she approached the bed and pressed a cool hand to his forehead. "You're burning up," she said, all professional distance temporarily forgotten in the face of his illness. "How long have you been feeling unwell?" "Yesterday. Just thought it was fatigue." Brian closed his eyes, finding unexpected comfort in her touch. "You should have said something." Her tone held gentle admonishment as she moved efficiently around the room, drawing blinds to dim the harsh morning light. "I'm calling Dr. Patterson." Brian wanted to protest, to insist he just needed rest, but the energy required seemed beyond his grasp. Instead, he watched through fever-blurred vision as Lois took charge, speaking firmly with his doctor, then returning to his side with water and medication. "Doctor says it's likely the flu that's been going around. He's sending over prescriptions, but meanwhile, you need fluids and rest." Her hand returned to his forehead, a small frown creasing her brow. "Your temperature is concerning. We need to bring it down." The "we" struck Brian as significant, a small word that bridged the careful gap they had maintained. What followed was a day unlike any Brian had experienced since childhood. Lois cared for him with a gentle efficiency that left no room for embarrassment, bringing cool compresses for his fever, ensuring he took his medication, preparing simple broth when his appetite eventually returned. In his weakened state, the walls Brian maintained so carefully began to crumble. Fever loosened his tongue, and as evening approached, he found himself speaking thoughts usually kept tightly guarded. "Why did you take this job?" he asked, as Lois adjusted his pillows, her proximity filling his senses with the light scent of lavender from her skin. She looked surprised by the question. The salary was excellent. The benefits included housing. It was ideal for my situation. "But managing someone else's life can't be fulfilling for a writer," Brian pressed, his usual filters weakened by illness. Lois sat on the edge of the bed, her weight creating a gentle dip in the mattress. "Not everyone has the luxury of prioritizing fulfillment over security." No bitterness colored her tone, just simple truth. "My sister's education comes first. My writing will wait." The quiet dignity in her sacrifice humbled Brian. "Tell me about your writing." Something in his genuine interest seemed to reach her. For the first time since they'd met, Lois's professional veneer slipped completely, revealing the passionate soul beneath. "I write about human connection," she said, her eyes lighting with an inner fire. "About the spaces between people, how we bridge them, why we fail to, what happens when we succeed. I believe there's something sacred in real connection, something worth exploring." "Read me something," Brian requested, his fever making him bold. "Please." Lois hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get my notebook." When she returned, she sat in the armchair beside his bed, nervousness evident in how she held the worn leather journal. "These are rough drafts," she warned. "I'm not a literary critic," Brian assured her. Just someone who wants to hear your voice. She began to read. A poem about two strangers passing on a busy street, the momentary connection in their glance containing universes of possibility never explored. Her voice transformed as she read, becoming richer, deeper, infused with passion that her professional demeanor usually concealed. Brian closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. In his fever state, the poem seemed to speak directly to his soul, to the loneliness he had buried beneath success, to the connections he had denied himself out of fear. When Lois finished reading, silence filled the room, not awkward, but reverent, honoring the moment of shared vulnerability. "That was beautiful," Brian finally said, opening his eyes to find her watching him with uncertainty. "You have a gift." "Thank you." Her smile held shy pleasure at his praise. Emboldened by the moment's intimacy, Brian found himself confessing, "My ex-wife hated poetry, called it pretentious nonsense." "That says more about her than about poetry," Lois replied. "Vanessa saw the world in terms of acquisitions," Brian continued, surprised at how easily her name, usually avoided, slipped from his lips. "Everything and everyone was evaluated for usefulness or status, including me." Lois's eyes held no pity, only understanding. "And you began to see yourself that way too?" The simple insight struck Brian with the force of revelation. "Yes," he admitted. "Success became the only measure of worth I trusted." "Because it couldn't be taken away?" Lois suggested softly. "Except it can," Brian said, memories of his father's financial ruin surfacing. "My father built a company from nothing, lost everything in the recession of '08. He never recovered, not financially, not emotionally." "Is that why you drive yourself so hard?" Brian had never articulated it before, even to himself. "I watched how people treated him differently after the money was gone, how they looked through him, like he'd become invisible. I swore I'd never be vulnerable that way." "Yet true connection requires vulnerability," Lois observed gently. Their eyes met in shared understanding. For the first time in years, Brian felt truly seen, not as Brian Hanna the millionaire, but simply as Brian, a man with fears and scars and unfulfilled longings. The moment stretched between them, intimate yet somehow safe in the context of his illness and her care. Then Lois stood, the movement breaking the spell. "You should rest," she said, her professional mask slipping partially back into place, though her eyes remained warm with new understanding. "I'll be nearby if you need anything." As she moved to leave, Brian caught her hand, a gesture that surprised them both. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's my job," she replied, but the gentle pressure of her fingers returning his squeeze belied her words. After she left, Brian drifted into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in days, Lois's poem echoing in his mind, offering a vision of connection. He had long denied himself. The next morning brought reduced fever and increased clarity. Brian woke to find a breakfast tray beside his bed, along with a note in Lois's elegant handwriting. "Meeting rescheduled. Doctor coming at 10. Rest." The care behind the simple directive touched him deeply. For years, Brian had prided himself on needing no one, on being self-sufficient in all things that mattered. Yet there was unexpected comfort in being cared for, in allowing someone else to take control, even temporarily. When Lois checked on him later, Brian noticed subtle changes in their interaction. The rigid professionalism had softened into something more natural, more genuine. Their shared vulnerabilities had created a bridge neither had anticipated. "You're looking better," she observed, bringing fresh water and medication. "Feeling better," Brian confirmed. "Thank you for taking care of me." "That's what your job is," Brian finished with a small smile. "Is it also your job to read poetry to your employers?" A blush darkened Lois's cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "No, that was Something else. Friendship, Brian suggested. Lois considered this. Perhaps the beginning of one. The honesty in her response touched Brian deeply. Not presuming too much, not retreating behind professionalism, just acknowledging the subtle shift in their relationship with simple truth. "I'd like that," Brian said softly. As his recovery progressed over the next few days, they fell into a new pattern. During the day, Lois maintained her professional efficiency, keeping his business running smoothly from a distance. But evenings brought a different dynamic. Shared meals where conversation flowed more freely, discoveries of mutual interests in classical music and forgotten literature, discussions that stretched late into the night. Brian learned that Lois played the piano, having taught herself on a second-hand keyboard in college. That her favorite composer was Debussy, explaining the music he'd heard upon his return. That she spoke fluent French, having worked as an au pair in Paris during a gap year before her mother's illness called her home. Each revelation was like uncovering a precious stone, beautiful in its own right, but more meaningful as part of the emerging mosaic of who Lois Walters truly was. In turn, Brian found himself sharing parts of himself long kept private. His childhood in a small Pennsylvania town, his early struggles to launch his company, his complicated relationship with wealth, and the doors it opened while simultaneously building walls. By the time Brian's health returned fully, something fundamental had shifted between them. The professional boundaries remained, but alongside them had grown something neither had expected, a connection based on mutual respect and genuine understanding. What had begun as an employer-employee relationship had evolved into something neither could easily define, but both secretly treasured. Chapter 4. Crossed Lines. The first gift appeared on a Tuesday morning. Lois entered her office in the east wing of Brian's mansion to find a leather-bound journal resting on her desk. No note accompanied it, but none was needed. The rich brown cover, embossed with subtle tree patterns, echoed a comment she had made days earlier about finding inspiration in nature. Lois ran her fingers over the supple leather, a smile touching her lips. It was thoughtful in a way that spoke of genuine attention. Brian had listened, remembered, acted. Later that day, when she brought him reports to sign, their eyes met in silent acknowledgement. "Thank you for the journal," Lois said simply. "Your current one looked nearly full," Brian replied, his casual tone belied by the warmth in his eyes. The second gift arrived the following week, a first-edition collection of poems by Langston Hughes that Lois had mentioned admiring. Then came a fountain pen with her initials engraved in silver, a rare book on French Impressionist composers. Each gift was not merely expensive, but thoughtfully chosen to reflect something uniquely meaningful to her. Lois knew she should discourage these gestures. The professional boundaries between them were already blurring dangerously, yet each gift represented not an attempt to impress or obligate, but a simple statement. "I see you. I hear you. You matter." After years of putting everyone else's needs before her own, first her mother's during her long illness, then her sister's education, then the demands of countless employers, being seen so completely by someone was intoxicating. For Brian, giving the gifts brought a pleasure he had forgotten existed. Not the hollow satisfaction of business achievements or acquisitions, but the genuine joy of bringing happiness to another person. Each time Lois's face lit up with surprise and pleasure, something inside him grew stronger, as if long dormant. Parts of his heart were reawakening. Their daily interactions took on new dimensions. Conversations lingered longer than necessary. Finding reasons to be in the same room became a subtle game, neither acknowledged, but both played willingly. Their fingers would brush during the passing of documents, sending currents of awareness through them both. Both recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. Both chose to continue forward. Then came the invitation that could not be misinterpreted. "The hospital's annual charity gala is this Saturday," Brian said one morning, as Lois reviewed his schedule for the week. "I'd like you to accompany me." Lois looked up from her tablet, surprise evident in her expression. "As your assistant." "As my guest," Brian clarified, his steady gaze leaving no room for misunderstanding. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implication. They both understood this would be a definitive step across the line they had been cautiously approaching. "That would be inappropriate," Lois finally said, her professional mask firmly in place. "Because? Because I work for you," she stated the obvious. "Because people would talk." "Let them," Brian replied simply. "I'm asking you to attend a charity event with me, Lois, not proposing marriage." The slight twitch of her lips betrayed her amusement at his directness. "Still, it would complicate things." "Some complications are worth having," Brian countered. Seeing her continued hesitation, he added more gently, "Just consider it, please." Lois did consider it, wrestling with herself for 2 days before finally agreeing. Her acceptance came with conditions. She would meet him there, arrive and leave. Separately, maintain appropriate public behavior. Brian accepted these terms without argument, understanding her need to preserve some professional distance even as they both acknowledged the shift in their relationship. The night of the gala arrived, with a flutter of anticipation neither had experienced in years. Brian arrived early, finding himself checking the entrance every few minutes, an unfamiliar nervousness coursing through him. When Lois finally appeared, the sight of her stole his breath. She wore a deep blue gown that seemed to capture starlight, her hair styled in an elegant updo that accentuated the graceful line of her neck. Simple diamond studs, a gift from her late mother, she would later tell him, were her only adornment. She needed nothing more. Her natural beauty commanded attention without effort. Brian crossed the room to greet her, aware of curious glances, following his path. "You look stunning," he said simply, offering his arm. "Thank you," she replied, accepting with a smile that held equal parts nervousness and pleasure. "This is quite different from our usual budget meetings. Considerably more enjoyable," Brian agreed, leading her into the ballroom. The evening unfolded with surprising ease. Lois charmed everyone she met, her intelligence and genuine warmth, creating instant connections. Brian found himself seeing his usual business associates through new eyes, noticing which ones treated Lois with genuine respect and which subtly changed their demeanor upon learning she worked for him. "Dr. Richard seems quite taken with you," Brian observed, after watching the neurosurgeon engage Lois in animated conversation about community literacy programs. "He's passionate about education access," Lois replied. "His foundation has done remarkable work in underserved communities. Should I be jealous?" The question slipped out before Brian could censor it. Lois's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That would imply certain rights you don't possess, Mr. Hanna." The formal address was deliberate, reminding them both of their official relationship, yet her eyes held a warmth that softened the words. "Not yet," Brian replied quietly. The honesty of his response silenced them both. It was the first explicit acknowledgement of what had been building between them, not merely friendship, but the potential for something deeper. Later, as they swayed, together on the dance floor, the remaining pretense of mere professional courtesy fell away. Brian held her carefully, respectfully, yet with unmistakable tenderness. Lois's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, her body maintaining a proper distance that nonetheless felt intensely intimate. "People are watching us," she murmured, her eyes meeting his. "Let them," Brian replied, his voice low. "I'm only seeing you." The music surrounded them, creating a private world within the crowded ballroom. As the song drew to a close, Brian found himself drawing her imperceptibly closer, his gaze dropping to her lips. Lois's breath caught, her eyes darkening with an emotion that mirrored his own. The moment stretched between them, electric with possibility. Brian leaned forward slightly, the barest beginning of movement toward what they both suddenly, desperately, wanted. Then Lois's phone vibrated from her small clutch purse. Under normal circumstances, she would have ignored it, but she had left instructions to only call for emergencies. "I'm sorry," she whispered, reluctantly stepping back. "I need to check this." Brian nodded, releasing her with equal reluctance. He watched as she moved to a quieter corner, answering the call with her back turned to the crowd. Even from a distance, he could see the moment her body tensed, her free hand rising to cover her mouth. He was at her side instantly. "What's wrong?" "It's Zora, my sister," Lois explained, her voice tight with fear. "She's in the emergency room. They think it's her appendix." Without hesitation, Brian took her elbow, guiding her toward the exit. "I'll drive you." "No, I can get a cab. You should stay." "I'm driving you," Brian repeated firmly. "This isn't negotiable, Lois." The relief in her eyes told him all he needed to know. Within minutes, they were in his car, speeding toward Philadelphia's University Hospital, where Zora had been taken. Throughout the 40-minute drive, Brian kept one hand on the wheel, the other holding Lois's, offering silent support as she made calls to Zora's roommate and the attending physician. Her fingers gripped his tightly, drawing strength from his steady presence. At the hospital, Brian's quiet authority smoothed their path, getting immediate updates and ensuring Zora would receive the best care. When they finally reached her room, Lois rushed to her sister's side, the family resemblance evident despite Zora's pain-drawn features. "You didn't have to come all this way," Zora said weakly, then noticed Brian standing in the doorway. "And you brought your boss." "He drove me," Lois explained simply, smoothing her sister's hair back from her forehead. Brian stepped forward, introducing himself with uncharacteristic awkwardness. "I'm sorry about the circumstances, but it's good to meet you, Zora. Your sister speaks of you often." Zora's eyes, sharp despite her pain, assessed him with intelligent curiosity. "Funny, she hardly mentions you, Zoe," Lois admonished gently. A small smile touched Zora's lips. "What? I'm about to have surgery. I get to be nosy." The surgeon arrived. Then, explaining the procedure and timeline, Brian stepped out to give them privacy, using the opportunity to make some calls of his own, ensuring Zora would have a private room, arranging for a specialist to consult if needed. When he returned, with coffee for Lois, he found her sitting alone, Zora having been taken to pre-op. The elegant gown and sophisticated hairstyle from earlier now seemed out of place under the harsh hospital lights, a reminder of the evening's interrupted potential. "She'll be fine," Brian reassured her, placing the coffee in her hands. "Appendectomies are routine." "I know," Lois nodded, though worry still creased her brow. She's all the family I have left." Brian sat beside her, their shoulders touching in silent comfort. "Not your only family," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Lois looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears she'd been too strong to shed until now. "Brian, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "Just know that I'm here, whatever you need." She leaned against him then, allowing herself to draw strength from his solid presence. Brian's arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her with a tenderness that needed no words. They remained that way through the surgery, through the recovery room wait, through the relief of hearing everything had gone perfectly. When Zora was finally settled in her room, sleeping peacefully under sedation, Lois turned to Brian with exhausted gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "I didn't do anything you wouldn't have done for someone you care about," Brian replied. The words hung between them, an indirect acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to name. The almost kiss on the dance floor now seemed from another lifetime, yet the connection it represented had only strengthened through the night's crisis. As dawn broke over the hospital, Brian watched Lois sleeping uncomfortably in the chair beside her sister's bed, her hand still holding Zora's. In her vulnerability, her complete dedication to someone she loved, Brian saw something he had been missing in his own life. Not just romantic love, but the deep, abiding connection of true belonging. Professional boundaries had been irretrievably crossed. There would be no going back to employer and employee, not with the weight of this night between them. Whatever came next would be new territory for them both, frightening perhaps, but filled with possibilities neither had dared imagine before tonight. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. 3 weeks after Zora's appendectomy, life at the mansion had settled into a new pattern. Lois had taken a week off to care for her sister, during which Brian had visited daily, bringing food, books, and his surprisingly comforting presence. Upon her return, the careful professional distance they had once maintained was replaced by something warmer, more open, hovering on the edge of acknowledged attraction. They still hadn't spoken directly about the almost kiss at the gala, but its ghost lingered between them, coloring their interactions with anticipation and possibility. Brian found himself inventing reasons to be near her. Coffee in the garden became a morning ritual. Work discussions extended into dinners, filled with conversation about everything except business. Lois's laughter, once rare, now filled the halls of his home regularly. He discovered he could listen to that sound forever and never tire of it. For Lois, the shift was equally profound. She found herself looking forward to each day in a way she hadn't in years. Her writing flowed more freely, inspired by emotions long dormant now awakening. The walls she had built to protect herself from disappointment, from vulnerability, from the pain of wanting what seemed impossible, began to crumble in the face of Brian's steady, patient interest. The change was evident in small ways, lingering glances, casual touches that sent electricity through them both, private jokes that required no explanation. Even Zora had noticed during her recovery, raising an eyebrow at the way Brian anticipated Lois's needs before she voiced them. "He's not what I expected," Zora had commented during one of his visits. "For a rich guy, he's surprisingly human." Lois had smiled, unable to argue the point. The Brian Hanna she was coming to know was indeed nothing like the cold, successful businessman she had initially expected to work for. Then the past arrived unannounced on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. Lois was organizing files in Brian's home office when the doorbell rang. Assuming it was a delivery, she opened the front door without checking first, a decision she immediately regretted. The woman, standing on the doorstep, exuded wealth and confidence. Tall, slim, impeccably dressed in designer clothing that probably cost more than Lois earned in a month, with sleek blonde hair framing delicate features. She assessed Lois with cool blue eyes that missed nothing. "I'm here to see Brian," she announced, her tone making it clear she expected immediate compliance. "Tell him Vanessa is here." The name hit Lois like a physical blow. Vanessa, Brian's ex-wife, the woman who had married him for his money and left when she found someone wealthier. "Mr. Hanna is in a meeting," Lois replied, her professional mask slipping into place automatically. "May I ask what this is regarding?" Vanessa's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched. "You may not, and I'm sure whatever meeting he's in can wait." She moved forward as if to enter, clearly expecting Lois to step aside. Lois did not move. "I'm afraid Mr. Hanna sees visitors by appointment only. I'd be happy to check his availability for later this week." Something calculating entered Vanessa's expression. "You must be new. The domestic staff usually knows better than to interfere." I'm Mr. Hannah's executive assistant, Lois corrected coolly, and I manage his schedule, which currently doesn't include you. Before Vanessa could respond, Brian's voice came from behind. Lois. It's all right, Lois. I can see her. Lois turned to find him standing in the hall entrance, his expression unreadable. She stepped aside, allowing Vanessa to enter with a triumphant smile. Brian, darling, Vanessa purred, moving forward, to kiss his cheek. You've let the landscaping go. Those roses need attention. Brian did not return her kiss, maintaining a careful distance. What do you want, Vanessa? So direct, she laughed lightly. Can't I simply visit an old friend? We were never friends, Brian replied evenly, and you never do anything without a purpose. Vanessa's smile remained fixed, but something hardened in her eyes. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Her gaze flickered meaningfully toward Lois. Brian's response surprised them both. Anything you have to say can be said in front of Lois. A subtle shift occurred in Vanessa's demeanor as she reassessed the situation. Her eyes moved between them, noting their proximity, the protective way Brian had positioned himself slightly in front of Lois. I see, she said softly. How interesting. Lois felt herself being evaluated and dismissed in the span of seconds. To Vanessa, she was not competition, merely an amusement, a diversion for a wealthy man's boredom. I need to finish those reports, Lois said, unwilling to be a pawn in whatever game Vanessa was playing. I'll be in your office if you need me, Brian. As she moved to leave, Brian caught her hand briefly, giving it a reassuring squeeze before releasing her. The simple gesture spoke volumes to Lois, to Vanessa, to Brian himself, a statement of allegiance that surprised them all. From the office, Lois could hear murmurs of conversation from the living room, though not the words themselves. She tried to focus on work, but her mind kept returning to the woman in the other. A room, beautiful, sophisticated, sharing history with Brian that Lois never would. Doubt, her old companion, crept in with poisonous whispers. What was she doing? Allowing herself to develop feelings for her employer, a man whose world was so far removed from her own, whose ex-wife looked like she belonged on a magazine cover. An hour passed before Brian appeared in the doorway of the office, his expression troubled. She's gone, he said simply. Lois nodded, keeping her eyes on her tablet. I hope everything is all right. Brian moved into the room, perching on the edge of the desk near her. Vanessa's husband left her. She's testing the waters to see if I might be interested in reconciliation. The directness of his statement startled Lois into looking up. And are you interested in Vanessa? Brian's laugh held no humor. God, no. That chapter of my life closed long ago, and painfully enough that I have no desire to reopen it. Relief washed through Lois, followed immediately by shame at her reaction. It wasn't her place to have feelings about Brian's personal life, despite the recent shift in their relationship. Then why did she think you might be? She asked carefully. Brian sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because Vanessa views relationships as business transactions, and on paper, it would be convenient. She needs financial security again. I'm single, successful. A logical merger, Lois said, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her tone. Exactly, Brian agreed. Except I learned the hard way that marriages built on convenience rather than love are doomed from the start. Love. The word hung in the air between them, charged with implication. She's very beautiful, Lois observed, hating herself for the insecurity, but unable to suppress it. Brian's gaze softened as he looked at her. Yes, she is, and completely hollow beneath the surface beauty. I was too blinded by the package to see what was inside, or rather what wasn't. His honesty touched Lois deeply. Thank you for telling me. I don't want secrets between us, Brian said simply, especially not about the past. The statement felt significant, an acknowledgement that whatever was developing between them mattered enough to warrant complete transparency. But Vanessa's visit had cast a shadow, reminding Lois of the gulf between their worlds. Brian might say Vanessa meant nothing to him now, but they shared a common background, common experiences, a lifestyle Lois had only glimpsed from the outside. Over the following days, Lois found herself pulling back slightly, creating subtle distance where before she had been drawing closer. The easy comfort they had developed seemed suddenly complicated by the stark reminder of Brian's past and the inherent differences in their lives. Brian noticed the change immediately, but didn't press. Instead, he gave her space while making it clear through small gestures that his interest hadn't wavered. Fresh coffee waiting when she arrived in the morning, a new book of poetry on her desk, respect for the distance she needed, paired with quiet signals that he would be there when she was ready to close it again. Then came the invitation to accompany him to the opening of a new community arts center he had helped fund. Not a date, he insisted, a work event where her assistance would be genuinely helpful. Lois accepted with professional courtesy, telling herself it was simply part of her job. The evening itself proved more difficult than she anticipated. Watching Brian move through the crowd with easy confidence, she saw him through new eyes, eyes influenced by Vanessa's calculating assessment, by the curious glances of people wondering about the nature of their relationship, by her own insecurities, about belonging in his world. "You've been quiet tonight," Brian observed as they drove home later. "Everything all right?" Lois stared out the passenger window at the passing city lights. "Just tired," she lied. Brian was silent for a moment, then pulled the car into a small lookout point overlooking the city. He turned off the engine and shifted to face her. "Talk to me, Lois," he said softly. "What's really going on?" The genuine concern in his voice broke something inside her. "Vanessa called me yesterday," she admitted. Brian's expression darkened. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't your problem to solve," Lois replied. She wanted to have lunch, to get to know the woman who's caught Brian's interest, as she put it. "And did you agree to this lunch?" Brian asked carefully. "No, but it made me think. About." Lois sighed, finally voicing the fear that had been growing since Vanessa's visit. "About whether I belong in your world at all. About whether whatever is happening between us is real or just convenient proximity." Brian's jaw tightened. "Do you really think so little of what we've shared?" "No," Lois said quickly, "but I think realistically about the differences between us. You've been married before, to someone from your own social circle who understood your world inherently, and it still failed. Because it was built on false foundations," Brian countered. "Not because we came from similar backgrounds." "And what about Rebecca?" Lois asked quietly. "The relationship after your marriage?" Brian looked surprised that she knew the name. "How did you—" "You mentioned her when you were ill," Lois explained. "You said she couldn't handle your emotional walls." Understanding dawned in Brian's eyes. "And you're afraid you can't either." "I'm afraid of a lot of things," Lois admitted. "Of misreading signals, of risking my job for feelings that might not be reciprocated, of becoming another chapter in your past that ended painfully." The vulnerability in her confession seemed to touch Brian deeply. He reached across the console, taking her hand in his. "Rebecca left because I wouldn't let her in," he said quietly. "Because after Vanessa, I built walls so high that no one could reach me. I thought that was safer than risking pain again." He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you, Lois Walters, you didn't try to scale those walls or tear them down. You simply opened a window and let fresh air in until I realized I was suffocating in my own isolation." The poetry of his words touched something deep inside her. "Brian, I'm not finished," he said gently. "You're right that there are differences between us, But they're superficial, matters of circumstance, not character. What matters is that for the first time since I can remember, I'm not just existing, I'm living, and that's because of you." Tears pricked at Lois's eyes as the sincerity in his voice washed over her. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I," Brian admitted. "Terrified, actually, but some things are worth being afraid for." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'm not asking for decisions tonight. Just don't pull away because you think you don't belong. You belong exactly where you choose to be." The city lights spread below them like fallen stars, beautiful and distant. Yet in the quiet interior of the car, something precious and fragile was taking shape. Understanding built on honesty, connection strengthened through vulnerability. The shadows of Brian's past still lingered, as did Lois's fears about crossing the remaining distance between them. But as they sat together in companionable silence, watching the city below, both felt the subtle shift from uncertainty toward possibility, from what had been toward what might be. Chapter 6. Truth in Rain. The storm arrived without warning. One moment. The evening sky above Brian's mansion was clear, stars beginning to appear as dusk settled. The next, dark clouds rolled in with alarming speed, bringing with them a sudden drop in temperature and an ominous stillness. Brian and Lois had been reviewing quarterly reports in his study, maintaining the careful professional distance they'd silently agreed upon since Vanessa's visit. Though the undercurrent of attraction remained strong between them, Lois had retreated behind her efficient assistant persona, and Brian had respected her need for space. "Looks like we're in for some weather," Brian remarked, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. His voice was casual, but his eyes lingered on Lois's profile as she bent over the reports, the elegant curve of her neck exposed where she'd pinned up her hair. "The forecast didn't mention a storm," Lois replied, checking her phone. She looked up, catching Brian's gaze. For a moment neither spoke, the air between them charged with something more volatile than the approaching storm. Lois broke the connection first, clearing her throat. "But the radar shows it's moving in fast. I should head to the guest house before it hits." As she gathered her papers, their hands brushed. The brief contact sent a jolt of awareness through them both. Brian's fingers instinctively curled around hers, holding for just a second longer than necessary. Lois's breath caught, her eyes meeting his again with undisguised longing, before she carefully withdrew her hand. The first raindrops began to fall, gentle at first, then quickly transforming into a torrential downpour. Lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the mansion's foundations. The lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the house into darkness. "Perfect timing," Brian muttered, reaching for his phone to activate the flashlight. The blue-white glow illuminated Lois's face, close enough that he could see the rapid pulse at the base of her throat. "The backup generator should kick in," Lois said, moving toward the door, her voice betraying a nervousness that had nothing to do with the storm. But even as she spoke, they both knew the old generator had been scheduled for replacement next. A week. The mansion remained dark as the storm intensified outside, rain lashing against the windows with violent force. "You can't go out in this," Brian said definitively, his hand finding the small of her back as they navigated the darkened hallway. The warmth of his palm burned through the thin silk of her blouse. "It's not safe." Another flash of lightning illuminated Lois's face, her expression caught between practicality and something else. Desire mingled with apprehension at being trapped with Brian in the darkened house. The tension that had been building between them seemed magnified by the sudden intimacy of their situation. "The library has candles," Brian suggested, breaking the momentary silence. His hand remained at her back, guiding her through the darkness. "And a fireplace. We'll be more comfortable there until the storm passes." Lois nodded, acutely aware of his proximity, as they moved through the darkened hallways. The library had always been her favorite room in the mansion, warm, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, comfortable leather chairs, and a stone fireplace that provided both heat and soft, flickering light. Brian found matches in a drawer and began lighting candles, placing them strategically around the room. The golden glow created pools of warm light amid the shadows, transforming the space into something intimate and otherworldly. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain pounding against the windows, occasional lightning illuminating the room, in stark white, before returning it to the gentle warmth of candlelight. "At least we won't lack for reading material," Lois joked softly, trying to ease the charged atmosphere. As Brian knelt, he smiled up at her, the flames casting dancing shadows across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw. Silver linings. Lois watched him work, struck by how the simple act of building a fire made him seem more accessible, more human than the polished businessman the world knew. His sleeves rolled up revealed strong forearms dusted with dark hair. The concentration in his expression as he arranged the kindling showed a patience she'd come to cherish. As the fire caught and began to spread warmth through the room, they settled into chairs facing each other across the hearth. The storm had created a strange pocket of time and space, separate from the regular world, from normal routines and barriers. In the flickering light, with rain drumming against the windows, everything felt both intensely real and slightly dreamlike. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Brian said after a long moment of companionable silence, "about what's been happening between us." Lois felt her heart rate increase, but kept her expression neutral. "Has something been happening?" Brian's smile was gentle, knowing. "You're too honest a person to pretend you don't feel it too." The directness of his statement left no room for evasion. Lois looked into the fire, gathering her thoughts before meeting his gaze again. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I feel it. But that doesn't mean it's wise to act on it. Because I'm your employer? Partly. And partly because," she hesitated, searching for words, "because your world and mine are very different. Because relationships that cross those kinds of boundaries rarely end well." "Is that what you're afraid of?" Brian asked, his voice dropping lower. "The ending or the beginning?" The question struck closer to home than Lois was comfortable with. "Both, maybe." Brian leaned forward, the firelight catching in his eyes, turning them to warm amber. "Vanessa's visit unsettled you. Wouldn't it unsettle anyone to meet the ex-wife of the man there?" Lois trailed off, unable to find the right word for what they were to each other. "Developing feelings for," Brian supplied quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. Lois didn't deny it. "She made me see the reality of your life more clearly. The circles you move in, the expectations, the history, all the things I'm not part of." "Vanessa means nothing to me," Brian said with quiet intensity. "What we had was never real to begin with. It was a transaction disguised as a marriage. Her beauty and social connections for my wealth and status." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, as if nature itself were reacting to the emotional currents flowing between them. Brian rose from his chair and moved to sit on the ottoman at Lois's feet, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, smell the subtle cologne that had become achingly familiar. "I've spent years building walls to protect myself from being hurt again," Brian continued, his voice low and intimate. "Not just because of Vanessa, but because of every relationship where I wondered if I was valued for myself or for what I could provide. Even with Rebecca, who genuinely cared for me, I couldn't bring myself to truly let her in." Lois listened, understanding flowing between them with each shared truth. "And now?" Her voice wavered slightly with the question. "Now I find myself wanting to tear down those walls," Brian admitted, reaching for her hands. His touch was warm, his fingers stroking gently across her knuckles. Because of you. Because you've never once treated me like Brian Hanna, millionaire. From the beginning, you've just seen me. The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep within Lois. She had indeed always seen beyond his wealth and status to the man beneath, complicated, guarded, but fundamentally good-hearted and far more sensitive than he allowed the world to know. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Not of you, but of what I feel for you, the intensity of it. I've always been the practical one, the responsible one. This feels like jumping without knowing where." "I'll land." Brian rose from the ottoman to kneel directly before her chair, his hands still holding hers. "I'm scared too," he admitted, "but some fears are worth facing." Lightning flashed again, illuminating their joined hands for a brief moment before returning them to the gentle glow of firelight. In that moment of connection, the professional boundaries that had defined their relationship seemed to dissolve, leaving only two people facing the powerful current flowing between them. "Whatever happens," Brian whispered, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "Whatever we decide, I need you to know that you've made me feel alive again, after years of just existing." The simple honesty of his words broke something open inside Lois. The careful restraint she had maintained, the practical considerations that had kept her emotions in check. Without overthinking, she leaned forward and placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of evening stubble beneath her palm. "You've done the same for me," she admitted softly, their eyes locked, the air between them charged with possibility. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Brian closed the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that began gentle, almost questioning, then deepened as Lois responded with equal hunger. Years of denial, of holding back, of professional distance melted away in the heat of their connection. Brian's hands slid up her arms to cradle her face, his touch reverent yet possessive. Lois's fingers wound into his hair, drawing him closer as the kiss intensified. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Brian rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I found you asleep in my bed," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. Lois laughed softly, her hands still framing his face. "I've wanted you to since our first morning coffee discussion." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the library, surrounded by books and flickering candlelight, a different kind of power was building, the quiet strength of two people, finally being honest about their feelings, finding truth in the darkness that they might have continued to avoid in the light. Brian drew her down onto the thick library rug before the fire, their bodies pressed together in a perfect fit. Each touch, each kiss was a discovery, an exploration of territory long imagined but never known. Clothing gave way to bare skin, illuminated by firelight, as they learned each other with exquisite patience. "You're so beautiful," Brian whispered, against her throat, his hands tracing the curves of her body with reverence. Lois arched into his touch, her own hands mapping the contours of his shoulders, the strong planes of his back. Their coming together was neither rushed nor hesitant, but a perfect meeting of equals, passionate yet tender, intense yet deeply intimate. As they moved together before the fire, the storm outside seemed to echo their own release of long-held restraint. Thunder crashed as they reached the peak together, their cries mingling with the sounds of the tempest. Afterward, wrapped in the softness of a throw blanket Brian had pulled from a nearby chair, they lay together, watching the fire's glow cast shadows across their entwined bodies. The intimacy of their physical connection had stripped away the last barriers between them, leaving a new vulnerability, a new honesty in its wake. "What happens now?" Lois asked softly, her head resting on Brian's chest, his heartbeat strong. Beneath her ear, Brian's fingers traced lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "Whatever we want to happen," he said, "whatever feels right for both of us." They talked through the night as the storm gradually subsided, sharing stories and secrets, dreams and fears. Professional titles and social differences receded into insignificance as they discovered the far more important similarities in their values, their hopes, their understanding of what truly mattered in life. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world glistening with raindrops. As sunlight filtered through the library windows, Brian and Lois looked at each other with new clarity. The night's connection, both physical and emotional, had changed something fundamental between them, creating a foundation of honesty and understanding that went far beyond employer and employee. "No regrets?" Brian asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Lois shook her head, leaning into his touch. "None. You? Only that we waited so long," he replied, drawing her close for another kiss that promised many more to come. Whatever came next would not be simple or straightforward. There were still practical considerations, professional boundaries, and personal fears to navigate. But as they watched the sun rise together, both felt the quiet certainty that what they had found in each other was worth the complexity it would bring. Truth, like rain, had washed away pretense, leaving only what was real and vital between them. Chapter 7. Letting Go. The morning after the storm, something had shifted. Though Brian and Lois maintained professional decorum during working hours, their interactions held a new warmth, a sense of shared understanding that hadn't existed before. Their honest conversation in the candlelit library had created a bridge between them, one they were both carefully crossing, step by measured step. Yet Brian knew one significant barrier remained: the unresolved ghosts of his past. For anything real to grow between them, he needed to find true closure, not just with Vanessa, but with the patterns that had shaped his approach to relationships. The call to Vanessa was brief and direct. They would meet for lunch, neutral territory, public with clear boundaries, no games, no manipulations, just the honest conversation they should have had years ago. Lois said nothing when he mentioned the meeting, but her eyes held questions she was too proud to ask. "This is something I need to do," Brian explained gently. "For myself, for us, if there's to be an us." Understanding softened her expression. "I know," she said simply. "Some chapters need proper endings before new ones can begin." The restaurant Vanessa chose was predictably exclusive, the kind of place where the wealthy went to see and be seen. Brian arrived early, watching his ex-wife make her calculated entrance, turning heads with practiced precision. Once that entrance would have filled him with pride. Now he saw it for what it was, a performance, beautiful but empty of genuine substance. "You look well," Vanessa remarked as she took her seat, evaluating him with the same appraising eye she'd use for an investment opportunity. "Your assistant taking good care of you, I see." Brian let the insinuation slide past without reaction. "Thank you for meeting me, Vanessa." "How could I refuse? You've been ignoring my calls for weeks." She signaled impatiently for a waiter. "The Dom Perignon, please. Just water for me," Brian countered, surprising her. Vanessa's perfect eyebrows arched. "Since when do you refuse champagne?" "Since I realized I prefer clarity to celebration." Brian folded his hands on the table, studying the woman he had once believed he loved. "I want to talk about us, about what happened, about moving forward." For the briefest moment, something genuine flickered across Vanessa's face. Perhaps surprise at his directness or recognition that this conversation would not follow her script. "There's nothing to discuss," she said dismissively. "We married, it didn't work out, we moved on. Now we have an opportunity to try again, with more wisdom and experience." "That's not why I'm here," Brian said quietly. Vanessa's smile faltered. "Then why are you?" To finally say what I should have said years ago. Brian took a deep breath, centering himself. "You didn't break me, Vanessa. For a long time, I thought you had. I blamed you for making me doubt myself, for making me build walls around my heart. But that was giving you too much power and myself too little credit. The waiter arrived with their drinks, creating a momentary pause in the conversation. When he departed, Brian continued with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found solid ground after years of drifting. The truth is, we never should have married. We wanted different things from the beginning. I wanted love, you wanted security and status. Neither of us was honest about that, with each other or ourselves. Vanessa's carefully composed expression hardened. How convenient to rewrite our history, now that you've found someone new to warm your bed. This isn't about Lois, Brian countered. This is about me, finally understanding that what happened between us freed me to find something real, something authentic, and for that I actually owe you gratitude. The sincerity in his voice seemed to catch Vanessa off guard. For a brief moment, her perfect facade cracked, revealing a glimpse of the insecurity that drove her relentless pursuit of security through wealth. You've changed, she observed, with unexpected perceptiveness. I'm becoming who I should have been all along, Brian replied. Someone who values substance over appearance, truth over convenience, real connection over social advantage. Vanessa studied him over the rim of her champagne glass. And your assistant provides this real connection? What Lois provides or doesn't provide isn't relevant to this conversation, Brian said firmly. This is about you and me finding proper closure so we can both move forward without bitterness or regret. How noble, Vanessa murmured, but the usual cutting edge in her voice had dulled. And what if I'm not interested in closure? What if I've realized my mistake in leaving you? Then I'm sorry, Brian said with genuine compassion, because I've moved on. Whatever we had is firmly in the past, where it belongs. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression then. A reluctant recognition of truth, perhaps, or simply the calculation that this particular strategy had failed. Well, she said, setting down her glass with deliberate precision. I suppose that's that, then. It is, Brian agreed. But I wish you well, Vanessa. I truly do. As he drove home afterward, Brian felt lighter than he had in years. The conversation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, not just for dealing with Vanessa's sudden reappearance in his life, but for his own journey toward emotional wholeness. For too long, he had allowed past wounds to determine his present choices. It was time to let go of that pattern, to step into a future unencumbered by old scars. He arrived home to find Lois waiting in his study, her expression uncharacteristically troubled. One look at her face told him something had changed. What's wrong? He asked, crossing the room to her. I've received an offer, she said, her voice carefully controlled. From Horizon Literary Review. They want me as a senior editor. Brian recognized the name immediately, one of the most prestigious literary magazines in the country, known for launching major writing careers. The kind of opportunity Lois had dreamed of. That's wonderful, he said genuinely, though something in her expression made his heart constrict. Isn't it? It's in Chicago, Lois said quietly. They need me there in person, at least initially. Implication hung in the air between them. Chicago was hundreds of miles away. What had been slowly building between them would be tested by distance, by separation, by the pull of different lives. Brian felt a moment of pure selfishness, the desire to ask her to stay, to choose him over this opportunity. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't do that to her. Couldn't be another person who asked Lois Walters to put her own dreams aside for someone else's needs. When would you start? He asked instead, keeping his voice steady. 2 weeks, Lois replied, searching his face for his reaction. It's all happening very quickly. 2 weeks. The timeline felt both impossibly short and painfully long. 2 weeks to decide what they meant to each other, what they wanted to build, how they would navigate this unexpected turn. "You have to take it," Brian said, the words costing him more than he showed. "This is your dream, Lois." Surprise flickered across her features, followed by a complex emotion he couldn't quite read. "You don't think I should stay?" "I think," Brian said carefully, "that I care about you too much to be the reason you turn down something you've worked so hard for." Lois moved toward him then, closing the distance between them. "But what about us, what we've been building?" Brian took her hands in his, holding them gently but firmly. "If what we have is real, and I believe it is, then it can survive some distance and time apart. This doesn't have to be an ending, it could be just a different kind of beginning." "Long distance rarely works," Lois said, giving voice to the fear they both felt. "Most things worth having rarely come easily," Brian countered. "Besides, I own a plane. Chicago isn't exactly unreachable." A reluctant smile touched her lips at that. "Is this your way of saying you want to try?" "This is my way of saying that I care about your happiness as much as my own," Brian said softly. "That I want to see you achieve everything you've worked for. And yes, that I want to find a way forward together, if that's what you want too." Tears shimmered in Lois's eyes, but they were complex tears, joy at his support mixed with the pain of impending separation. "I don't want to lose what we've found," she admitted. "Then we won't," Brian promised, drawing her close. "We'll find a way to make it work." The 2 weeks that followed were bittersweet. During the day, Lois trained her replacement, a capable young woman named Maya, who looked at the mansion with the same overwhelmed expression Lois herself had once worn. In the evenings, Brian and Lois spent every moment together, no longer pretending their relationship was merely professional. They didn't rush physical intimacy, both understanding instinctively that what was growing between them deserved patience and care. Instead, they talked for hours, sharing thoughts and dreams, planning how they would maintain their connection across the distance. Brian would fly to Chicago when his schedule allowed. Lois would return for long weekends. They would talk every day, not as employer and employee, but as two people building something precious together. On the morning of her departure, Brian drove Lois to the airport himself, her modest luggage loaded into his expensive car, a visual representation of their different worlds, finding harmony. At the security checkpoint, Lois turned to him, her eyes filled with emotions too complex for words. "This isn't goodbye," Brian promised, touching her cheek gently. "It's just intermission." A smile touched her lips at that. "I'll hold you to that. I'm counting on it." Brian kissed her then, not caring who saw or what they might think. A gentle, promising kiss that spoke of beginnings rather than endings. As he watched her walk through security, disappearing into the crowd beyond, Brian felt an ache of loss, tempered by something stronger, hope. For the first time in years, he was choosing to believe in possibilities rather than guard against. Disappointment, he was letting go of control, of certainty, of the careful protection of his heart. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, he realized with sudden clarity, exactly what living fully required. Chapter 8. Distant hearts. With Lois gone, Brian's mansion felt emptier than ever before. Her absence was palpable in every room, spaces that had come alive during her. Time there now seemed to echo with silence. At night, he found himself wandering to the library, where the memory of their first time together by the fireplace haunted him. He would sit in the same spot on the rug, running his fingers over the place where they had lain, remembering the softness of her skin in the firelight, the taste of her lips, the sound of her breathing as she slept in his arms afterward. Even with Maya's efficient presence, the house had reverted to what it had been before Lois arrived, impressive but hollow, a showcase rather than a home. The bed, where he'd first found her sleeping, seemed impossibly large and cold without her. Rather than retreating into the loneliness that had once been his constant companion, Brian channeled his energy into transformation. If distance would be part of their story for now, he would use the time to become the man he wanted to be when they reunited. He began therapy, finally confronting the abandonment issues stemming from his childhood and his father's financial collapse. The process was painful but necessary, excavating old wounds so they could properly heal. "I keep pushing people away before they can leave me," he admitted to his therapist during a particularly difficult session. "With Lois, for the first time, I'm terrified not that she'll leave, but that I won't be worthy of her staying." "What makes you think you're not worthy now?" the therapist asked. Brian considered this, staring out the window at the rain-washed city below. "Because she sees a version of me I'm still becoming. I want to deserve the way she looks at me." In the evenings, he wrote to Lois about these revelations, not just emails or texts, but handwritten letters that required thought and care, mirroring the deliberate attention she had always given to their home. Letters where he poured out his heart in ways he never could before meeting her. He reconnected with his cousin Michael, his only remaining family, rebuilding a relationship that had withered under the pressures of Brian's relentless work schedule and emotional unavailability. Their tentative lunches evolved into genuine friendship, filling a void Brian hadn't fully acknowledged. "You seem different," Michael observed during one of their meetings. "More present, less guarded." Brian smiled, thinking of Lois. "I'm learning that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with." Most significantly, he renovated the mansion, replacing cold elegance with warmth and character. The formal dining room became a welcoming space designed for conversation rather than impression. The unused guest wings transformed into areas with purpose, a community meeting space, a library open to local writing groups. He planted a garden of wildflowers beneath his grandmother's oak tree, where he had first watched Lois writing in her journal. Every change was a conversation with her absence, a way of holding her close despite the distance. At night, he would lie awake imagining her reaction to each transformation, picturing her smile, the way her eyes would light up seeing her influence made concrete in the walls that had once felt so impersonal. In Chicago, Lois thrived professionally. Her editorial instincts proved sharp, her dedication earning respect among colleagues who had initially viewed her with skepticism. She built a life there, a small apartment filled with books, weekend visits to museums, a writing group that challenged and supported her work. Yet despite her success, she missed Brian with an intensity that surprised her. Her body ached for him in the quiet hours after midnight, the warmth of his skin against hers, the weight of his arm draped across her waist as they slept, the way his eyes darkened with desire when she undressed for him. Physical pleasures they had only begun to explore before separation had forced abstinence upon them. Nights were the hardest. She would wake reaching for him, finding only empty sheets, the phantom sensation of his touch lingering on her skin. During one particularly lonely evening, she found herself pressing her face into a sweater he had left behind, inhaling the fading scent of him, tears streaming down her face at the bittersweet comfort it provided. Their nightly phone calls became anchors in both their days. Hours spent sharing thoughts, dreams, fears, and mundane details that accumulated into intimacy despite physical distance. "I saw a man today who walked exactly like you," she told him one evening. For a second, my heart stopped. "I thought somehow you'd surprised me." "Would you have liked that?" Brian asked, his voice dropping lower, igniting the familiar heat in her belly despite being hundreds of miles away. "More than anything," she admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and forget you're not beside me. I reach for you before I remember." "I know," he said softly. "Last night I dreamt you were here. I could feel your heartbeat against my chest. your breath on my neck. Waking up was difficult. The hunger in his voice matched her own, a shared longing that could only be partially satisfied through words. On nights when the separation felt unbearable, their conversations would turn intimate, whispered, desires and memories, creating a bridge between their physical realities. "Tell me what you would do if you were here," Brian would ask, his voice rough with need, and Lois would close her eyes, picturing him alone in their bed, and describe in exquisite detail how she would touch him, taste him, love him. Her words, creating a tapestry of sensation that left them both breathless and aching for more than distance allowed. Their letters, handwritten and deeply personal, bridged the gap technology couldn't fill. Brian wrote of his therapy revelations, his growing relationship with Michael, the changes to the mansion. Lois shared her editorial triumphs, her progress on her novel, her discoveries in a new city. "I'm discovering who I am without you," she wrote in one letter, her pen pressing firmly into the paper with the urgency of her feelings, "which makes me more certain of who I want to be with you. This separation hurts in ways I never imagined, but I'm starting to understand it was necessary, not to test our feelings, but to confirm them. Every day apart only strengthens my certainty that what we have is real and rare." Brian replied, "I'm becoming someone who deserves you, not because of what I own, but because of who I am. The mansion is changing, but more importantly, so am I. I'm learning that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the greatest strength. That expressing need isn't dependency, but honesty. That loving you completely, without reservation, doesn't diminish me, but makes me more fully myself than I've ever been." When their schedules allowed, they stole precious weekends together. Brian flying to Chicago, where they explored the city as tourists by day and rediscovered each other's bodies by night. Their physical reunion always intense with the urgency of limited time. Or Lois returning to the mansion, where each visit revealed new changes reflecting Brian's evolving priorities. During one such visit, 2 months into their separation, Brian showed Lois the renovations to the East Wing, now a potential community writing center. "What do you think?" he asked, watching her expression as she explored the transformed space with its comfortable writing nooks and wall-to-wall bookshelves. "It's wonderful," Lois said sincerely, trailing her fingers along a handcrafted desk. "But why? You never mentioned interest in community outreach before." Brian's answer came with quiet certainty. "Because I'm learning that wealth means nothing if it isn't serving something greater than myself. You taught me that, Lois." That night, as they lay tangled in sheets still damp from their lovemaking, Lois traced the lines of Brian's face in the moonlight, memorizing him anew. 2 more months, she whispered. "Then my contract allows for remote work. If you still want—" Brian silenced her with a kiss, fierce with certainty. "I want. Every day, every hour you've been gone, I've wanted you here. Not just in my bed, but in my life, permanently." The physical distance that would soon separate them again made each moment more precious. Their goodbye kiss held promises neither spoke aloud, but both felt deeply, of patience, of commitment, of a future they were both working toward, separately, yet together. As Brian watched her plane depart the next day, he felt not the emptiness of loss, but the fullness of anticipation. Their hearts might be distant, but they had never been more connected. Chapter 9. Return to each other. After 3 months of separation, Lois arrived at the mansion unannounced on a crisp autumn afternoon. She had negotiated a remote position with Horizon, a flexibility they offered only after her work had proven indispensable, and wanted to surprise Brian with the news. Maya answered the door, her usually composed face breaking into a genuine smile. "He's in the garden," she whispered. Conspiratorially, "Go, I'll bring your bags in." Lois made her way through the house, noticing more changes. family photographs where abstract art had once hung, comfortable furniture replacing pristine showpieces, books left open on side tables, suggesting actual use rather than decoration. The mansion felt lived in now. It felt like Brian. She found him beneath the oak tree, head bent over papers spread across a wooden table he'd installed near the spot where she used to write. Sunlight filtered through autumn leaves, casting dappled shadows across his concentrated face. Something inside Lois stilled at the sight of him, the certainty that despite the success she'd found in Chicago, this was her true north, her center, her home. "The view here is still my favorite," she said softly. Brian looked up, disbelief and joy transforming his features in an instant. He was across the garden in moments, wrapping her in an embrace that erased 3 months of distance in a heartbeat. "You're here," he whispered into her hair. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" "Because I'm not just visiting," Lois replied, pulling back to see his reaction. "I'm coming home, if you'll still have me." The expression that crossed Brian's face then, pure, unguarded happiness, was answer enough before he even spoke. "House has been waiting for you," he said. "So have I." That evening, over dinner in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, another change she appreciated, Brian told her of his plans for the community writing center, his reconnection with his cousin, his therapy progress. But it was the subtle changes in him that moved Lois most. The ease in his posture, the readiness of his laughter, the quiet confidence that had replaced his driven intensity. "You seem more at peace," she observed. "I am," Brian acknowledged. "For years I thought success meant accumulation, money, property, achievements. Now I understand it's about alignment, living according to what truly matters." "And what matters to you now?" Lois asked. Brian reached across the table, taking her hand. Connection, purpose, creating something meaningful. His fingers tightened, gently around hers. "You." The days that followed were a gentle recalibration, learning each other anew after months of evolution apart. Lois set up her remote office in a sunlit corner of the library. Brian adjusted his schedule to create space for both work and presence. They fell into domestic rhythms that felt both novel and deeply familiar, as if they had been practicing for this shared life all along. Unknown to Lois, Brian had been planning. The weekend after her return, he began laying out an elaborate path through the garden, creating a journey through symbolic stations of their relationship. A first edition of Hughes's poetry, where they had first discussed literature, her original journal where she had read him her poems during his illness, a piano where he had first heard her play Debussy. Each station held a letter describing what that moment had meant to him, how it had changed him, how it had built the foundation of his love for her. The path would end at the cottage he had purchased at the edge of his property, a simple, charming home like the one Lois had once described dreaming of as a child. There, he planned to propose not with an extravagant ring, but with a simple band engraved with the first line of the poem she had read to him during his fever. But the morning before, his planned proposal, misunderstanding, threatened to unravel everything. A call from Vanessa, followed by an urgent meeting Brian couldn't explain, led Lois to find a jeweler's receipt in his jacket for a ring being designed by Vanessa Hannah. The name, with its painful echo of Brian's past, stung like betrayal. Had Vanessa somehow reclaimed her place in his life? Had their separation rekindled something Brian had thought extinguished? When Brian returned home, he found Lois packing, her face a mask of controlled pain. "What's happening?" he asked, bewildered. "What are you doing?" "I think we both made a mistake," Lois said quietly, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I shouldn't have come back so quickly. We needed more time." "Lois, what are you talking about?" Confusion and alarm mingled in Brian's voice. "Talk to me." She turned to him then, vulnerability winning over pride. "Are you getting back together? With Vanessa?" The question was so unexpected, so completely opposite to reality, that Brian's confusion only deepened. What? No! Why would you think that? The jeweler's receipt in your pocket, for a ring, for Vanessa Hannah. Understanding dawned on Brian's face, followed by a rueful smile. It's not what you think, at all. He took her hands, gently pulling her away from the half-packed suitcase. I was going to wait until tomorrow, but I think now is the time. He led her downstairs and through the garden, bypassing the elaborate path he had planned, moving directly to what mattered most. As they rounded the curve of the driveway, the small cottage came into view, freshly painted with wild flowers, growing around the porch, exactly like the childhood home Lois had once described losing when her father died. I bought it for you, Brian said simply. For us, if you want it. The jeweler's receipt was for your ring, but I used my former name with Vanessa because I didn't want to risk you finding out from gossip. I wanted it to be a surprise. Tears filled Lois's eyes as understanding replaced fear. Brian, I was planning something elaborate, he admitted. A whole journey through memories, but none of that matters. Just this question, Lois Walters, will you make a home with me, not in the mansion unless you want to, but here, in this cottage, or anywhere that feels right to you, because home, for me, is wherever you are. Chapter 10. Home Found. The cottage stood before them, bathed in late afternoon sunlight, small but beautiful, with climbing roses framing the door and a porch swing gently moving in the autumn breeze. It was nothing like the mansion's grandeur, yet infinitely more meaningful, a physical manifestation of Brian's understanding of what truly mattered to Lois. I can't believe you remembered, Lois whispered, taking in the details that echoed her childhood home. The blue door, the flower boxes beneath windows, the oak tree in the side yard. I remember everything you tell me, Brian said simply. Every dream, every hope. He led her inside, where simple, comfortable furnishings created not a showplace, but a genuine home. Books filled shelves built into the walls. A writing desk stood beneath the largest window, overlooking gardens that stretched toward distant woods. In the corner, a small piano waited, its polished surface reflecting the warm light. It's perfect, Lois breathed, turning in a slow circle. To take in every detail, Brian watched her, joy reflected in his eyes. It's yours, whether or not you say yes to my question. What question? Lois asked, though the answer thrummed through her veins like certainty. From his pocket, Brian withdrew not the ostentatious diamond one might expect from a millionaire, but a simple silver band. As Lois looked closer, she recognized words etched along its surface, the opening line from the poem she had read to him during his illness, the first time she had truly opened her heart to him. Between strangers, a glance holds universes, she read softly. Between lovers, a lifetime isn't. Enough, Brian completed the verse. Then taking her hand, he continued, I don't care if we live in this cottage, in the mansion, or in a one-room apartment. I don't care if your career takes us to Chicago or New York, or around the world. I only care that we're together. He knelt before her, not as Brian Hannah the millionaire, but simply as a man in love with a woman. Lois Walters, will you marry me? Will you make a home with me, wherever that may be? Tears filled Lois's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of completion, of coming home after a lifetime of searching. Yes, she whispered, yes to all of it. As Brian slipped the ring onto her finger, Lois felt the rightness of the moment settle into her bones. This was no fairy tale where a wealthy man rescued a woman from ordinary life. This was something far more profound. Two people who had helped each other become their truest selves, who had healed each other's wounds, who had built connection based not on what they could gain, but on what they could give. Then came the twist that neither expected. I have something to show you, Lois said, once the moment of their engagement had been sealed with a kiss that promised a lifetime more. From her bag, she withdrew a manuscript, bound pages that represented months of work, of heart, of truth. "Is this?" Brian asked, taking it reverently. "Our story," Lois replied. "The novel I've been working on. Horizon wants to publish it, if you approve, of course." Brian looked from the manuscript to Lois in wonder. "You wrote about us?" "I wrote. About finding home," she corrected gently. "About how sometimes home isn't a place, but a person. About how love isn't about grand gestures, but about seeing each other truly, even across differences of circumstance and history." Opening the manuscript, Brian read the dedication. "For B, who taught me that the most beautiful mansions are the ones we build in our hearts. Is that how you see me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "As someone who helped build something beautiful?" "It's how you are," Lois said simply. "To me, to others, if they look closely enough." 1 year later, they stood together on the cottage porch, watching as students from the newly established Walters Writing Foundation made their way up the path to the mansion, now partly converted into a community center. The foundation, funded by Brian but directed by Lois, provided scholarships and mentoring for aspiring writers from underprivileged backgrounds. Lois's novel had become a quiet success, touching readers with its authentic portrayal of connection across differences. Brian's company had shifted focus, integrating community benefit into its core mission rather than treating it as an afterthought. They had found a rhythm that worked for them, dividing time between the cottage, their private sanctuary, and the mansion, their community space, between Brian's business ventures and Lois's writing and foundation work. Their marriage was neither a fairy tale nor a business arrangement, but something far more valuable, a partnership of equals built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and deep, abiding love. "Happy?" Brian asked as they watched the sun setting over their shared domain. Lois looked up at the man who had become not just her husband, but her home. "Beyond words," she replied. "And that's saying something, coming from a writer." Brian laughed, the sound free and unguarded, in a way it had never been before Lois entered his life. "I love you," he said simply. "Not for what you gave me, but for who you helped me become." "And I love you," Lois answered, leaning into his embrace. "Not for the home you built, but for helping me find the home that was waiting in my heart." As darkness fell, lights came on in both buildings, the grand mansion and the modest cottage, each beautiful in its own way, each serving its unique purpose, each representing different facets of the life Brian and Lois had built together, different yet complementary, just like the two people who had found in each other not just love, but home.